Good morning. Good morning, beautiful people. It's truly an honor to be here. Thank you so much to USM and to the School of Social Work. Did you see that? For inviting me to be here this morning. It's truly an honor. When I first got the invitation, I was kind of like, wow, they want me to come and speak. They want C.J. Lawrence to come and speak about Black Lives Matter at USM. And you know, Ms. Williams, who invited me, said, yeah, we want you to come speak. And I said, well, do they know I'm bigoted black, like, when it comes to talking about these issues. And she said that was understood. And so I said, okay, well, fine, I can be there for that. And so, no, I'm truly honored to be here this morning. I was really trying to fight the stereotype of being late this morning. I got caught in traffic. There was a car accident on Highway 55, and you know, around about I guess it was 8:40 or 9 something. I started looking at my GPS, and the time started getting further and further away from the time I was supposed to be here. And I just felt the ancestors frowning down upon me. I apologize for this. No, it's truly a pleasure to be here. Again, my presentation this morning is entitled Black with No Chaser, a Melanated Millennials Guide to Coping, Surviving, and Thriving in America. You heard Mr. Haywood speak a little about some of If They Gun Me Down, and that's going to be one of the topics that I speak on today. Initially, I was invited to speak about Black Lives Matter, and I wanted to expand that a little bit because I think sometimes we tend to believe that Black Lives Matter and justice with regard to Black lives simply limits itself to the courtroom, and I think it expands far beyond that, and it starts outside of that. It starts with media and perception. It carries on with economic justice and injustice, and ultimately it also is something that we must as well address as far as reform is concerned, okay? And so the first section will be entitled If They Gun Me Down, Challenging Racial Implications and Misinformation in Media, Pop Culture, Education and Beyond. The second is Melanated Millennials, Poverty, Miseducation, the Racial Wealth Gap, Trauma, and Black Startups and Entrepreneurship. And 3, Black with No Chaser, the importance of self-care, self-awareness, controlling our narratives, and creating our own tables. Now that's an extensive amount to talk about within the time frame that I have, and so I first would ask that you bear with me. I'm going to try to be expedient in how I speak to each of the issues, but I know that this could probably be an actual course rather than just a 1-hour talk, and so I'm not going to inundate you with all that I could talk about with regard to today, okay? That being said, let's get right to it. Challenging racial implications and misinformation in media, pop culture, education, and beyond. First, I want to just talk to you about the impetus of If They Gun Me Down. If They Gun Me Down initially was something that I began to think about with what I refer to as the murder of Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida in February of 2013. By show of hands, how many are familiar with the Trayvon Martin case? Okay, good. So I'd say just to say about 90%. I know y'all are data people in social work, so I'd say about 90% of the people raised their hands, and that's a good amount. But one of the questions that I found myself confounded with when the Trayvon Martin case initially, and I'm referring to it as the Trayvon Martin case, although it was George Zimmerman who stood trial, because it felt like it was Trayvon Martin at times who was standing trial. And I found myself asking over and over again, how is it that a jury of Trayvon Martin's quote-unquote peers could find themselves more captivated and by the notion of the man who killed Trayvon Martin's fears than Trayvon Martin's fears? How did we arrive at that point? what was it that those six jurors, 5 white females, 1 Hispanic female, ultimately were the ones that made the decision in the Martin case. So in and of itself, there's a dynamic at play that is at issue, right? But we have to ask ourselves, what is it about a young black male that makes us not be able to empathize to the extent that we begin to question when a young boy, a teenager, is followed by a strange man at night, a strange man who was told not to follow him at night, a strange man with a weapon that was following him at night. How is it that we tend to focus on his fears rather than that young boy's fears, right? And so that coupled with what ultimately happened in Ferguson, and I'll get to that, started the If They Gun Me Down movement. This is the photo that I actually posted in August of 2014. The tweet that I sent out was, if they gun me down, which photo would the media use? And I used these 2 photos. One is me at my Tougaloo College graduation. I was one of the speakers. And the other is me at Halloween. That's a picture of me as Kanye West before Kanye West lost his damn mind. For Halloween. And, so that was the MTV Awards year, where he had the microphone and Hennessy bar. And so I was emulating Kanye West there, and that was the worst picture of myself that I could find, right? But it's literally not that bad of a picture, and the Hennessy bottle is full of tea. But the interesting thing is, I was actually, and Mr. Haywood stated to you that my father was at one time the city attorney for the city of Hattiesburg. Interestingly enough, as my father was transitioning out, I was nominated for the role of city attorney to replace him. There's some interesting Hattiesburg newspapers, well, not necessarily newspapers, but muckrakers, if you will, that will, we'll call it a blog, that puts out information. Interestingly enough, the very same when they said who was being nominated, when they told the story of me being nominated for city attorney, guess which photo they used? Not the one on top. They used the one on the bottom. So they literally proved the point that I was trying to make by literally finding a photo from 2014 for something that I was nominated for in, I believe it was either 2016 or 17. He had to go back and look for that photo. But he found it, and I laughed because it was, a bit humorous that was an attempt to assassinate my character with the photo that I myself had used as essentially a self-deprecating photo. The issue, however, is that when he used that photo, as you can, I don't know if you all can see, but that's a microphone in my hand. I don't know if y'all remember Kanye taking the microphone and Taylor Swift. But that's a microphone in my hand, and the scary thing was when I started seeing comments, and people were saying things about the gun I had in my hand. Like that's the gun that, and this is in a very, I would say that Hattiesburg tends to lean at least moderately conservative. So having a gun really wouldn't be an issue for most. In fact, we see with these mass shootings right now that having a gun doesn't seem to be the issue that of focus. It tends to be more about mental health. And so the notion that I had a gun that I didn't have, and that I was somehow dangerous for having a gun, more dangerous than anyone else that might have had a gun, more menacing for having a gun, stuck with me. And it resonated in a way that made me understand that there was some work to do with regard to challenging media bias and the impact that media has on the narrative that's painted, because when we look at the reality of it, what we understand, ladies and gentlemen, is we tend to live in silos, right? Typically speaking, Black people are going to live where Black people live, and we may work together, but we go out in our separate directions many times. And so many times, media is the only thing crafting a narrative for how we get to know one another on some level. And so with that regard, if the only thing that you're seeing in media are stereotypical images such as mugshots and men being carted into courtrooms, herded in prison uniforms and things of that nature, then it starts to play upon your psyche with regard to who people are as a whole, when you don't really have another opportunity to have a relationship with them. And so the "if they gun me down" question was really more so about not so much which photo would be the right photo to select, as much as why is this a question that we're having to ask at all. Okay. This is Michael Brown. The initial photo is a photo of Michael Brown during his graduation. I used my graduation photo as well. The other photo is the photo that went out en masse. Initially, it was a photo of him at graduation, and then somehow suddenly the photo changed. And I saw a tweet, and the tweet was of Michael Brown laying on the ground dead. You could literally see his blood on the ground. And the tweet said, "Look at him laying there on the ground with his pants hanging down. I don't feel sorry for him at all." His pants warranted a death sentence in someone's eyes. And it was at that point that I began to believe that there was something that needed to be done, some type of disruption that needed to occur. I had no idea that it would become what it became, but it did become what it became. And that began to really spread like wildfire. Like literally my phone was blowing up that night, and I'm like, I don't know what the hell just happened on Twitter, but something happened, and it's continuing to happen because more and more people started posting, and people were coming up with these scenarios that I could never even imagine. And the reason that it was so incredible was because it was drawing attention to the narrative that was playing out in Ferguson. As you remember, there was an uprising occurring in Ferguson at the same time that all of this was going on, in addition to Michael Brown, because of the relationship between the police department and the citizens of Ferguson was one that had been a contentious one for quite a while. This was not something new. And so, you know, there was research done that showed that in Ferguson, about 70% more African Americans were being stopped and pulled over and ticketed and charged with crimes than their white counterparts, although they were not committing crime at a higher rate than their white counterparts. And so those dynamics were already at play. And so there was a bit of an insidious type thing going on, and that was ultimately a Department of Justice investigation that took place in the city of Ferguson that did establish that there was corruption within that police department that needed to be overhauled in the form of a consent decree. So initially I was going to talk to y'all about the history of Black people in America and an introduction to the American criminal justice system. I'll talk briefly about it, but due to time constraints, I'm not going to take you back 400 years. So, yeah, let's talk about it a little bit. With regard to policing, first I'd like to say that something to consider before doing this. I am an attorney by trade, criminal defense attorney. I've been practicing since 2007, and one of the things that obviously we see is that America, while it has 5% of the world's population, houses 25% of the world's prisoners. Of that 25% of the world's entire population of prisoners, about 70% of them are African American, right? So that's a substantial number, right? When you consider the amount of black people living here in America and the impact that the criminal justice system has on us directly. And so we have to understand the historical significance, one, of the fact that we never had any say in the writing of the laws that police us. You know, that goes back to the Dred Scott case and being considered one-fifth of a human being, and things of that nature, okay? So, policing in the South. In the South, economics drove the creation of police forces. They weren't centered on protection of any shipping interests, but they were protecting an interest. That interest was slavery, right? They wanted to make sure that slaves remained slaves because slavery was the law in the South at the time. And so complying with the law meant obeying your master, all right? Some of the institutions were slave patrols. They chased down runaways and prevented revolts, right? Justifiable revolts, when you take it into consideration. This happened in the 1700s and essentially birthed the policing movement as far as the South was concerned. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because while things were changing as far as integration was concerned, from Jim Crow all the way to the Civil Rights Movement, and the Black Codes, and while things were changing, that never changed. We were always subjected to the same judicial system as everyone else. While we, except for Reconstruction, had very little input in making the policies, we were always policed by those policies. Those policies were always levied against us. And so that's a significant thing to consider when you understand that the same institution that was creating the policies that were being executed against us was doing so with its impetus being born out of the slave patrol. How we are impacted today by policing and the prison system in general is a direct reflection of slavery. I travel to Parchment sometimes, and I've never been a slave before, but I would imagine that it probably looks something like Parchment. There's cotton fields. I mean, literally, there's land for miles around. This isn't like a prison. I mean, it does have bars, but the bars are not what keep you there. It's literally nowhere else to go. Unless you're gonna run for miles and miles and miles through cotton, through all types of farmland and marsh, and whatever else the Delta may have waiting for you, you're not getting off that property. And it's being utilized to, sorry, that's my dad calling. I mean, I guess he forgot that I was doing a presentation this morning and he was supposed to be it. I'm kidding, he had court. But no, seriously, essentially, Parchment is a slave plantation. And it's still being run as a slave plantation. And that's significant because people are profiting off of slaves in 2018 in Mississippi and in Louisiana at Angola prison and in Alabama at, I forget the name of the prison, but essentially all across the South, there are these little satellite plantation-like prisons that essentially have people working for about 18 to 40 cents an hour, creating things like Victoria's Secret. Yeah, it's interesting, right? And so the secret is that slavery created this. And what I want to say about the big dumbing down and why I think it's significant is because what we found in my law practice is that there seems to be a developing blueprint for how to get away with the murder and justification of Black death. There's 3 steps typically. First is the assassination of the body. The second is assassination of the character. And the third is justification of the killing based on the inability of the victim to defend their character because they're dead, right? So we'll start with Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin was 16 years old at the time he was murdered by George Zimmerman. One of the issues that arose, I hope that's the right way to use that, if not, my bad, was whether Martin had ever smoked marijuana before. Now, Martin was the one that got killed. How was this relevant? Why was this relevant? If a 9th grader had ever smoked, a 9th or 10th grader had ever smoked weed before, was one of the linchpins upon which this trial turned. That's significant because it turned the focus on the victim, and that was one of the first times, we saw it a lot of times. We saw it back with Emmett Till and whistling, but we definitely saw it one of the first times in our recent memories on a national level with Trayvon Martin, right? Because we had to campaign nationally for George Zimmerman to even be indicted for killing Trayvon Martin. It was like a month and a half before he even was indicted for shooting this kid. But they got him to focus more on marijuana than George Zimmerman following this stranger, following this kid with a gun. And whether he had ever been suspended from school, like, they really were out to paint this kid as the bad guy in all of this. Although you can literally hear on tape George Zimmerman say, they always get away. The police are saying, don't do anything, don't do anything. They always get away. Who is they? They is probably the same people that we see in media that begin to develop our perception. They is probably who those 6 jurors saw when they decided that between the 2 people, George Zimmerman was the one who was likely more in fear for his life, justifiably so, and defending his life, than the person who actually died, who literally called George Zimmerman creepy. He called him creepy. His friend testified that he called him creepy. Again, the reason that that's significant is because it created a blueprint for all of the other shootings and killings that were going to occur within the next few years. Trayvon Martin was the beginning. He was essentially the Emmett Till of the Black Lives Matter movement, okay? And what I mean by that is, Emmett Till died in either 56 or 57, I believe, but the civil rights movement and freedom summer really occurred in 1965, so about 10 years later. Now, with social media, things accelerate a little bit more, but in 2013, Trayvon happened, the hoodie movement happened. People started talking about this as a result of the George Zimmerman trial where he was acquitted. The first time Black Lives Matter was ever tweeted happened, right? And then people started coming out against injustice again in a major way. Mike Brown, Ferguson and the myth of the super Negro. I hope that terminology made you shudder a little bit because the idea of it makes me shudder. This is an image of Michael Brown, who was shot by Officer Darren Wilson approximately 14 times in August of 2014 after leaving the gas station and Officer Wilson confronting him about walking in the middle of the street. When Michael Brown was shot 14 times, he was standing approximately 60 to 70 feet away from Darren Wilson. There's a lot of talk about Darren Wilson and Michael Brown having struggled. There are witnesses that contradict that. There were no substantial injuries to Darren Wilson. And again, the shots that this autopsy determined occurred to Michael Brown's body. Michael Brown was about 6'2", 300 pounds. The shots that occur from 60 to 70 feet away. Why is that significant? Well, it's significant because I don't know if any of you have been at 6'2", 300 pounds before, but 60 to 70 yards away, it's a pretty good distance. It's probably at least from me to maybe the 4th or 5th row here, right? It may be even a little longer. All I know is it's gonna take a 300-pound man a little while to get from here to there. And for you to be in fear of your life, many questions have to be raised. Like, what is it about this young man that terrifies you to the extent that you believe that he could get from there to there in a flash? And I think what we talk about there, what we have to highlight is the myth of the superhuman black person, OJ. And all of the athletes, LeBron. Essentially, there's two ways to essentially consume us. Most of the times it's either through athletics. If you don't live where we live, if you're not from where we're from, then most of the time your only exposure to us other than work or other social settings are through sports and through either media like the news or some type of television. And because of that, it sets us a set of expectations within the minds of some. And so, essentially, what happened here is Darren Wilson, who was never indicted for the murder of Michael Brown, somehow convinced the jury that a man standing 60 or 70 feet away from him without a weapon caused him to fear for his life. And the grand jury determined that no probable cause existed based on that story, and that story alone, coupled with witnesses that stated he shot him from that distance, that was insufficient to, at the very least, indict him. Ladies and gentlemen, an indictment essentially is saying that probable cause exists substantially enough to stand a trial, right? To allow 12 people to gather for the purpose of determining whether or not Darren Wilson should or should not be guilty. Not whether or not he's guilty. That's not what's happening during a grand jury or convening or an indictment. Essentially, the only thing that the people in Ferguson were demanding was that he be tried for the murder. The court determined, the grand jury determined that it was not sufficient. So I'm saying the names of Alton, Tamir, Sandra, Eric, Walter, Philando, Oscar Grant, Ayanna Jones, Terrence Crutcher, Botham Jean, who was at his own home when an officer shot him, and subsequently it came out that he had weed in his home. It was his house, right? And I wish I could stop saying their names, but I can't, because these things happen and we have to talk about them. The fact that Tamir Rice was called a man, he was 12 years old. He was called a man. Tamir Rice was gunned down in less than 2 seconds. He was, on the police call, you can hear the person say, I think it's a toy, I think this is a kid, and I think he's playing, but you might want to just go check it out. In less than 2 seconds. Now the narrative that came out was, we told him to freeze and he didn't, and then we shot him. No, literally it was a drive-by, right? It's hard for me to watch these things, but if you saw it, you know it was a drive-by. And then you have the young man, well, essentially they let him bleed out for about 30 minutes. So it took him less than 2 seconds to shoot him, and 30 minutes to call the ambulance. Something to think about. Domestic terrorism and the toxic masculinity of white male fragility. Charleston, Pittsburgh, Tree of Life, Vegas, Charlottesville, most recent shooting in California, the Kroger shooter, and the culpability of 45, President Trump. It's the first time I'm calling that. I did it for y'all. Y'all might not know 45. One thing in common, right, is that these are all angry white men. I mean, really angry. And the way that their narratives are often treated are different from the way that these other young men's lives are characterized, young men and women are characterized. Oftentimes we get stories about these young men, like Dylan Roof, for instance. Of course, we know that he got taken to Burger King for a Whopper or something after having shot 9 people in Charleston at Mother Emanuel Church, right? We know that they talked about essentially him being a shy kid in the New York Times portrayal of him. And the alternative, when they talked about Michael Brown, one of the first things they said about Michael Brown was that he was no angel. Now, Michael Brown was the victim in the incident that resulted in his death. Dylan Roof was the shooter. And we have to ask ourselves about these subtleties, right? And about the way that the narratives are crafted and why who's crafting those narratives are significant, is significant, excuse me. The Kroger shooter and that crime, which was a hate crime, was not characterized initially as a hate crime, although he initially tried to go to a black church to shoot up the black church. The doors were locked, so he decided to go somewhere else. He went to Kroger, and he didn't fire indiscriminately upon people in Kroger. He literally told a white person that white people don't kill white people, as he shot 2 black people. We had to campaign for it to be deemed a hate crime. In the United States of America, data indicates that in 2017, hate crimes on the whole went up 17%. 17% in the last 3 years, since 2016. Hate crimes have exponentially continued to travel upward. We saw the Unite the Right rally and the statement, "Jews will not replace us," being chanted by neo-Nazis and skinheads and Klansmen. And we saw the result of this sentiment, anti-Semitism, in the form of the Tree of Life shooting, right? And so we're seeing the rise in that, and anti-Semitism actually was the highest one that, as far as rising, it was actually on par with the 17% in rising. So that's substantial. I think excuse me. Oh, that's Charlottesville. As you can see, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of angry people that won the election, right? They won. What you mad about? I don't know, but they were upset. At the Unite the Right, at the Unite the Right rally, right? They ultimately, somebody died as a result. Some people were beaten, people died, people were injured as a result of the Unite the Right rally. That's not something that's typically associated with the Black Lives Matter protest, right? They're not killing people. They're protesting for lives to be saved and for justice to be served. These white men, I'm not sure what they were upset about. The weaponization of police forces against black people, swimming, patronizing coffee shops, barbecuing, selling water, selling CDs, I'm sure that all of you can see by this image, if you ever seen the Barbecue Becky video, that Becky go, right there. That's Becky. And she literally called the police on two black men who were barbecuing in Oakland for using charcoal grills. And I don't know about y'all, but where I'm from, barbecue ain't barbecue if you ain't using charcoal. Okay? No offense to you gas users. But essentially, it's, you know, we made light of it, but it's a really serious subject when you take into consideration that the way that people are attempting to address issues that they may have with others is through weaponizing what they have seen over and over again be used to the detriment of those people, right? When the police were called to this situation, because we've seen what has occurred in Oakland and in Baltimore and in Chicago and throughout this country, we know that any instance where there's an encounter with police may be the last instance that a black man or a black woman or that a person of color might experience because of the current climate that exists and because of the history of the departments across the country and the culture of the departments across the country. Essentially, what we seem to be seeing is a real understanding that some whites see the police as their allies and our enemies. And as a result of that, they weaponize them and call them in situations that are seemingly mundane. And they sometimes result in us getting dragged out of coffee shops, dragged out of Starbucks, shot for selling CDs, and who knows what else, And that's something that really has to be taken into consideration, and that's something that also occurs, I believe, because of perception. Y'all, I got several other topics. I'm going to try to talk as much as I can, but my time is coming to an end, I believe. I'm willing to take questions. The other two, and I also be willing to send out this PowerPoint because I really want to continue this conversation with you. The second part of the presentation was going to be miseducation, the racial wealth gap, trauma, and black startups and entrepreneurship. I'll try to hit a few things really quickly if y'all are willing to be patient with me. Economic disenfranchisement and why economic justice is imperative as criminal justice reform. Slavery was my grandmama's grandmama ago. My granddad was born in 1918. Slavery was ended in 1865. I don't even know, that's my grandma. That might be my granddad's uncle ago, right? Or, but essentially, it's not nearly as long ago as we might think, and as a result, the economic disenfranchisement that occurred is also not as long ago as one might think. It's literally 3 or 4 generations ago. I knew the person that knew a slave, right? I saw them alive. And so generational wealth that was passed down to those families that benefited from slavery, whether it be directly because they were plantation owners or slave owners, or because they got jobs from plantation owners or slave owners, there were substantial benefits that occurred as a result and substantial detriment that occurred for black families. And the reason I say that is because I know for my black family, my mother and my father both have 8, 9 brothers and sisters. They both grew up in 1-bedroom homes with, they took baths outside of me. Hope they don't get offended by me telling them. But essentially, my mom said that they were poor to poor people. I believe the term she used was, we were Edgar Allan and Poe. So that's part, She told me, essentially that they struggled financially, and that essentially we are the first generation to, when I say we, I mean myself and my sister, and probably many young black millennials or black millennials across the country are the first generation to maybe have parents that have something they can pass down to them. And that were black landowners prior to the civil rights movement, prior to integration. But as a result of things like integration and gentrification and redlining, which I really would have liked to get into, people were divested of their wealth. Black people were divested of their wealth. We used to own all of the beachfront property along the coastline here in Mississippi before it was cool to own beachfront property. Eventually, we were either by force or by coercion divested of much of that property. Right here in Mississippi is something that you can look up. I posted this, I grabbed this meme from somewhere and I thought it was a good meme. Particularly you see a white male and a young black woman. And the caption down at the bottom says, "What's the matter? It's the same distance." Yeah, but it's a lot of obstacles that this sister had to overcome that he didn't necessarily have to overcome. I recall, I went to Tougaloo College. I recall basically 99, probably 100% of the people standing in the financial aid line waiting to get student loans. And I was one of them. No, I wasn't one of them because I had a personal scholarship, but I was standing in line until I realized I didn't need to be one of them. But the only reason I wasn't one of them was because I had a personal scholarship. But a lot of them were essentially signing up to own their first homes at 18 without understanding that's what they were doing. They were signing their lives over and going to be in debt, indebted to someone for the next 20 to 30 years of their life simply by trying to pursue an education to get out of poverty, to avoid that. So ultimately what we've seen is that essentially approximately 50% of these young people that try to go to college to better themselves, to take themselves out of their circumstances. When I say young people, I'm talking about young black people. 50% default on their student loans. Why? Because it's damn hard to get a company to hire you when your name is Devontae. You gotta change your name to Dave. I mean, I'm not suggesting that's what needs to be done, but I'm saying that it becomes very difficult after you get that expensive education to get a job that is a reflection of that. Ladies and gentlemen, I really wish I could keep going. There's so much that I'd like to talk to you about. There's so much I'm willing to talk to you about. But I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be here to talk with you about the things that I did get a chance to talk with you about today. My name is CJ Lawrence. This is entitled Black with No Chaser. I'll be willing to share it with any and everyone who needs a copy of the PowerPoint. If you have questions or comments, I'm opening the floor at this time for those questions, if that's okay. With the group in the back. Thank you again so much for the opportunity to speak with you.